Welcome back to another J. Harris Academy of Police Training roll call video. I am Sergeant Jason Felsing, and today we're going to be discussing State v. Connor White. It is out of the Appellate Division. It's unpublished. Just was decided on June 19th here of this year. Addresses a couple different things, but mainly if a motor vehicle stop was unlawfully extended. It's a hot topic, so let's delve into it. Just before midnight on September 20th of 2020, an officer observed the vehicle driven by the defendant had a partially functional tail light and witnessed the defendant improperly utilize a turn signal. The officer activated his emergency lights, conducted a motor vehicle stop. That defendant continued to drive for a minute before pulling over onto a side street. The officer requested that defendant's credentials, as we all do on motor vehicle stops, and asked that defendant why he delayed before pulling over. The defendant responded he was looking for a safe location to pull over and gave the officer his Pennsylvania driver's license and vehicle registration. He was unable to locate his insurance documentation at that time. The defendant further explained that the car was a rental and he was an Uber driver. Within minutes, another officer arrived on the scene. That officer had a police canine in his vehicle. The first officer asked the defendant about a cell phone and wallet he saw in the glove box. The defendant said that his phone belonged to a girl. The defendant also stated that he started the night in Philadelphia and had Uber drop-offs in Pennsauken and Cherry Hill. He could not recall his more recent stops, explaining he was unfamiliar with that area. The officer further questioned the defendant's account, stating that the defendant had not been coming from the direction of Cherry Hill, but instead from the opposite direction. The officer asked the defendant for the location of his next pickup. That defendant continued to give varied answers. Both officers returned to their patrol vehicles. The first officer checked whether the defendant had a New Jersey driving record, and the second officer checked that defendant's criminal history. Approximately 17 minutes into the traffic stop, these numbers are going to be important, these searches turned up with no results. The first officer told the second officer he would ask the defendant to step out of the car and return to the defendant's vehicle. The defendant then produced an expired insurance card. The officer asked the defendant to exit the car to see the taillight violation. 2 more officers arrived on scene. We're up to 4. According to the second officer, the defendant communicated calmly, politely, and cooperatively while seated in the car. After exiting the car, the defendant remained conversant, made eye contact, and did not appear jittery or disrespectful. As the first officer showed the defendant the taillight violation, he continued to ask questions regarding the defendant's prior whereabouts. That defendant did not provide specifics regarding his travels that night, but asserted if he could access his phone, he would display his Uber app to give the officers details. The defendant permitted an officer to retrieve his phone from the car. However, the battery was dead, and the defendant was unable to get it to turn on. Based on the circumstances and the defendant's failure to satisfactorily recount where he had been, the first officer asked the defendant for written consent to search the vehicle. The defendant here did not deny or grant consent, but objected to the request for consent. Approximately 31 minutes into the traffic stop, officers employed an exterior canine sniff of the vehicle. The dog positively indicated. Officers searched the defendant with negative results. The search of the vehicle yielded marijuana, controlled dangerous substances, packaging materials, a digital scale, a handgun, 2 extended magazines, and hollow-nosed bullets. Alright, so even though that's a lot to take in, we still understand that this case was heard because that defendant appealed this. They argue that the dog sniff was not justified here because officers lacked that reasonable and articulable suspicion, that RAS that we're always looking for. Honing this in on New Jersey law, of course, New Jersey follows the United States Supreme Court decision Rodriguez versus United States from 2015 and the New Jersey case State v. Dickey. These cover prolonging stops and broadening stops based on your reasonable suspicion. During lawful stops, police officers may ordinarily make inquiries incident to the stop, such as checking credentials, driver's license, registration, insurance, seeing if the driver has any warrants, things like that. Canine sniffs are certainly able to do that. They're lawful. They don't typically implicate constitutional implications because a canine sniff is always much less intrusive than a search. Even though these canine sniffs are typically allowed, if your agency has these or you have the ability to get a canine out there, an officer may not conduct a canine sniff in a manner that prolongs a traffic stop beyond the time required to complete the stop's mission, unless they possess reasonable and articulable suspicion to either further extend that stop and do so. There is always the issue that a lawful traffic stop may turn unconstitutional if the officer overly broadens the scope or prolongs that stop. Absent independent reasonable suspicion, a canine sniff that prolongs the stop is unreasonable and therefore unconstitutional. Delving back into this case, Here, the first officer had probable cause, PC, to execute a motor vehicle stop of that defendant's vehicle because he saw a partially functional taillight and he observed that defendant improperly utilized his turn signal prior to making a left turn. After lawfully executing the traffic stop, the officer appropriately made ordinary inquiries incident to the stop, including that defendant's whereabouts throughout the evening. Upon completion of the standard electronic investigation into that defendant's driving record and the criminal history, however, the lawful motor vehicle stop was finished then. At that point, the officers could have issued the relevant citations and permitted that defendant to leave. Coming back into that time frame that I told you was going to be important, in this case, the officers extended the stop for approximately 14 minutes after the purposes of the lawful traffic stop were satisfied, at which point they executed an exterior canine sniff of the vehicle because that defendant refused to provide a yes or a no for written consent to search that vehicle. Even though a reasonable officer would agree that the length of time that it took that defendant to pull over after the officer engaged his emergency lights is notable, it's still not sufficient to cause a reasonable suspicion of criminal wrongdoing. Similarly, the fact that that defendant was not the car's owner and had trouble producing a valid proof of insurance does not suggest that criminal wrongdoing is imminent here. Furthermore, that defendant's unfamiliarity with New Jersey and his inability to articulate his prior location and his destination are not ideal, but also not illegal, and they do not lead to reasonable suspicion at all. So here the court finally found that lacking a reasonable and articulable suspicion, the officers were not justified in extending the defendant's detention here beyond that amount of time necessary to address that initial traffic violation of the tail light or the lack of use or misuse of the turn signal. This here deems that canine sniff was unlawful. That canine sniff was executed long after the completion of the lawful traffic stop, and therefore it was unreasonably prolonging that traffic stop beyond the time required to complete that stop's initial mission. That concludes our roll call training today, folks. I appreciate you listening as always. As an instructor here at J. Harris Academy of Police Training, we do value giving you these roll call trainings. Please scan the link here on your QR code to see if there's any other things that you'd like to follow if you don't follow us on our socials. And again, keep a lookout for further roll call trainings. Everyone, please be safe and always remember that.